Hey everybody, thank you for joining us for our third and final session of Soul. Today we're going to look at the final characteristic of having a healthy soul. Today is all about limits for our soul. As we've talked about before, your soul was created by God, and since God is the ultimate creator, right? The creator of the universe, he makes the rules. He gets to make the rules. He gets to set the limits. But let's start off with having some fun first. So let's take a look at some of these weird rules. In Chico, California, it's illegal to own a nuclear bomb. In fact, there's a $500 fine. It's interesting. In Connecticut, it's illegal to sell a pickle that doesn't bounce. Didn't know they were supposed to. In Gainesville, Georgia, it's illegal to eat fried chicken with utensils. I don't think I do that, but I got to be sure I stay away from Gainesville. And finally, in Maine, it's illegal to dance to the national anthem. Again, I don't think I'm guilty of that. Show of hands, is anyone guilty of any of those? No? Well, good. You're in the clear. Those are pretty weird, but not all limits and laws are weird or silly. Some laws are actually really important. Take the speed limit, for example. I know that we don't always like to drive the speed limit, but those limits are there to keep us safe. In fact, a lot less people would die every year if all of us chose to follow that simple limitation. Our soul is the same way. God created you and designed your soul to exist in a specific way. Your soul cannot be healthy outside of God's limits. Let me say that another way and make it even clearer. Your life cannot thrive outside of God's plan. Limitations are not necessarily fun. Most of the time we do our best to get around the things that limit us. Nobody likes to be told no. But God put some limits on even Adam and Eve when they were in the Garden of Eden. After creating the humans, God placed them in the garden and He said, "You may freely eat the fruit of every tree in the garden except the tree of knowledge of good and evil. If you eat its fruit, you are sure to die." God wanted the very best for them, and so He placed that limitation for them. But as we know, they failed to restrain themselves and did exactly what God had commanded them not to do. The Bible's full of examples of limits that God has put, and we look at King David's life to find some more. A unique thing about David, just talking about him, but a unique thing about David's story is that we get to witness his ups and his downs, his highs and his lows. And through the Psalms, we get a chance to even read some of his prayers, his intimate conversations with God, and get to see his innermost thoughts. Limits and restraints are something that David both excelled and failed at during his time on earth. At one point, we'll talk about one of his times when he excelled, right? At one point, David gained so much popularity that it made King Saul jealous. He'd killed Goliath, he'd killed others in battle, and people started singing his praises. And he was jealous enough that he decided, I'm going to kill this David. I'm going to get rid of this guy. So that sent David running. One day while Saul was out chasing David and his men, David had a chance to kill Saul. It just so happened that Saul had stepped into a cave to go to the bathroom, and guess what? David and his men were hiding farther back in the cave, in that same cave. And while Saul was in there doing his business, David's men told him he should take that opportunity to kill Saul. That God had placed Saul into his hands, and it was a perfect opportunity. And after years of running for his life, this did seem like the perfect opportunity to make all of David's problems go away. Let's read what happens. So David crept forward and cut off a piece of the hem of Saul's robe. But then David's conscience began bothering him because he had cut Saul's robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this to my lord the king. I shouldn't attack the Lord's anointed one, for the Lord Himself has chosen him." So David restrained his men and did not let them kill Saul. David restrained himself and his men from killing Saul that day. Remember that for years, David's been hunted. He hasn't been able to go home. He had to leave his family. And he had to be on the run for his life this entire time. And yet, even cutting off some of Saul's robe ate at his conscience. It drove him crazy that he had done such a thing. David knew in his heart that it wasn't right to kill Saul. And he knew that God would not be pleased. So David didn't try to justify doing it. He said no to himself and to that temporary desire to get some relief from King Saul. Saying no to ourselves is never easy, whether it's saying no to eating junk food or saying no to an unhealthy relationship. It can be hard, but saying no is necessary for a healthy soul. Think about what your life would be like if your parents never said no to you. I mean, at first you'd go, "Oh, that's awesome, right?" And it may be awesome for about a week, but then you'd probably end up getting hurt doing that thing that you thought was going to be amazing. You saw it on video and tried to replicate it. Or you got sick from no sleep. Or you ate too much, or you ate the wrong things, or the house is a wreck and just disgusting because you never cleaned it. Do you see the irony? I mean, we hate limits. We naturally hate limits, but they're the things that keep us from hurting ourselves. King David had a great moment there where he restrained himself, but he also had a moment in his life when he failed to restrain himself. When he fell to temptation regarding Bathsheba, it went from bad to worse. If David had restrained his lust for Bathsheba, he wouldn't have experienced the pain and the hardship that came after. Limits show us how flawed we are and how incapable we are of controlling ourselves. You and I end up feeling like Paul, like there's a war going on inside of our hearts. But the great news is that everything is not hopeless. Romans 8:5-9 tells us that God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. And since we have been made right in God's sight by the blood of Christ, he will certainly save us from God's condemnation. Here's the bottom line. God doesn't save us because we follow his limitations. We follow his limitations because we've been saved. I'm going to say that again. God doesn't save us because we follow his limitations, because we will never be able to do it. Instead, we follow God's limitations because we've been saved. You know, while we might not like the limitations that God has made for us now, they're here because he knows what's best for us. So here are some practical steps for us to take this week as we close this series out. Number one, don't resist the limits that God places on our souls. They're here to protect our lives and teach us to walk more closely with him. Number two, maybe you need to ask yourself, am I currently doing anything that is outside of God's limits? Think about the words you say, the movies you watch, the TV shows, the videos you watch, and all the activities you engage in. Are all of those things within God's design for your life? That's a question we got to ask. Finally, there may be some habits that we need to get rid of, old habits, ways of thinking that we need to leave behind. Why? Because God has already saved us and we want to have a deeper relationship with him. We want to have a healthy soul, and sometimes that healthy soul means, all the time, it means we have limitations. Thanks for joining us as we talked about our soul and talked about something we don't typically talk about. But I want to thank you for joining us for this series of lessons. We hope that you are safe, healthy, and we can't wait to see you again in person. And until then, remember that you are his, you're loved, and what you do matters.